But again, so I have the great honor to introduce two incredible gentlemen, Christopher Hitchens and Salman Rushdie, as I say, men who need no introduction. Thank you.
All right, well, just to make sure there isn't an excess of introductions, I'm going to keep it quite brief. I mean, I think the thing that's, if you've known Christopher for a while, you have this fear when you read a thing called a memoir that you're going to know all of it. And there are going to be these sort of like polished anecdotes coming out in the familiar sentences, which might be fun for you, but less fun for me. And one of the things I think that was actually touching about reading the book was how much there was in it about Christopher that I didn't know, and how much more there was about the things that I did know. So I think it is, even for those of us who've known each other too long, it's a really remarkable book because it's intimate, but it's also public. It's a book which is about literature and about friendship and about coming to America and, of course, about politics and this big and strange life which ranges from bikini waxes to trashing Mother Teresa via Henry Kissinger and various presidents. One of the things that I just thought to start off with, it struck me when I was reading it how eclectic you have been in your dislikes. That you disliked Reagan, you say, but you really disliked Clinton. You liked Margaret Thatcher, sort of, but you disliked God. My favorite title of all your books is the title of the book about Mother Teresa, which is called The Missionary Position. One of the things I think is surprising as an affection in the book is how often one hears a sympathy with military men, whether British, like your father, or American in the field or whatever. There's a real sense of understanding of what it is that they do and risk and so on. So anyway, here we have this, you were a strong opponent of the Contras in Nicaragua, and yet a supporter of the intervention in Iraq. So the question is, if you had to place yourself now in this journey from Trotskyist youth to the present day, how would you place yourself in that spectrum? Because it's a pretty broad spectrum.
Yes. And I just to get one thing out of the way, the problem with the Brazilian wax is what makes it worse for chaps than for chicks is, and if you think about it, if you're gonna rip, you have to grip. And my bet with Graydon Carter has always been that he can ask me to do anything except incest and Scottish dancing. and I'll say yes, but this was worse than waterboarding, actually, which was the second worst. Horror show of the lot. Well, my little chapter, I'm so sorry, my little title, partly suggested by something that Salman has said on another matter. He's always doing this to me. He said, the problem with your title, God is Not Great, is it's exactly one word too long. And I thought, how right that is. Too late. No. Is my late friend Joseph Heller came up with a paradox that everybody knows. Even people who don't remember that it was a book or a film know what Catch-22 is. Hitch-22 is a paradox in a minor key. I no longer have any political party allegiance. I'm registered as an independent. I don't have any ideological allegiance either, though I think still, in many ways, like a Marxist does. And my strongest allegiance is to a group of people, some of them well known to you, such as Professor Richard Dawkins and Dr. Sam Harris and others, who are basically committed to skepticism, adamant for doubt, you might say, resolved to be unresolved, certain only of the uncertainty principle. And that might sound like a slightly soft position to adopt late in one's life, but actually it's not in the present circumstances, I would claim, because it commits us against the new totalitarians, the people who already have all the information they need, who have indeed been vouchsafed the truth, had it revealed to them, have no further questions, know exactly how entitled they are to tell everyone else what to do. And fighting that lot has become the cause of my life.
You know, I remember one of the very first times I ever met Günter Grass, he talked about doubt as an ideology. You know, and he said that the great event of his life had been after growing up in a household in which basically the lies of Nazism were accepted as unquestionable truth. The war ended, and he discovered, actually when the Americans came and he was interned in a camp and so on, he discovered not only was that not true, but that it was appalling and evil as opposed to just wrong. And what it did to him was make him unable to hold any opinion with great certainty after that without immediately thinking of its counterweight. You know, so, I mean, yes. I understand about doubt and skepticism, but do you find in all this accumulation of positions, none of which you appear to have recanted, you know, I mean, that's to say, in the course of this book...
I'm not ashamed of any of them,
no. So, but do you feel a contradiction between them? I mean, do you...
Yes. There was a book that had a big effect on me, and I'm sure on a lot of people here, and perhaps on you, Arthur Koestler's novel, Darkness at Noon, which I used to know almost by heart, and where the chief character, Nicholas Rubashov, whose patronymic name, by the way, is, as I point out in the book, Salmanovich.
Yeah.
Nicholas, son of Salman Rushdie, who has been an old Bolshevik and a real hard fighter in the class war, and has fallen foul of Stalin. But he says when he's back in the cell, this time for the last time, he reflects that his fatal flaw has always been that he's able to see the other person's point of view. And that immediately makes you suspect, because the next thing you'll be doing is explaining to someone what the enemy's point of view is, so that you better understand it. And then they think, how does he know that so well? What's his motive here? And the police mentality kicks in, and the mentality of orthodoxy and conformism. So what I try to do throughout the story is, every time the chance comes up, is to show how I tried anyway to have a consistently anti-totalitarian position. I think that's very important. It's more important, in other words, what you think is much less important than how you think.
And the rest of it is just very well then I contradict myself.
And some of it, yes. I mean, look, I knew when I was young that I was not anti-war in the case of Vietnam. I was for the Viet Cong. I was not anti-war. I didn't make any bones about it. We carried the flag of the NLF.
Yes, we had these terrible chants.
Yes, we did.
All of which have survived. The rhythms that we invented in the 60s, people still use. They've just put more boring words to them. But, you know...
No, enlarge.
Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh.
Oh, yes.
You know, what do we want? Revolution. When do we want it? Now.
Yeah, and hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids do you kill today?
Today, exactly. We made this shit up.
Once adapted, but yes. You know. And also retrospectively adapted at one point for the wars of religion in France. Hey, hey, Innocent III, how many Albigensians have you interred? Do you remember that?
That would have gone down well, particularly in French.
Yes, I also knew perfectly well that the regime of Ho Chi Minh was a Stalinist regime, that as a Trotskyist I was opposed to it, that people who thought like me were put to death by it. But I didn't think that anything could change until Vietnam had been reunified and the long postponed revolution had been completed. So you had to carry around two sets of books the entire time. I mean, our lot disrupted the Ho Chi Minh Memorial meeting in London with another slightly simplistic slogan.
Just say a little more about our lot. Because
our lot was a group called the International Socialists, which was a post-Trotskyist groupuscule or fraction, very admiring of the work of Rosa Luxemburg.
You were Luxembourgist.
Yes. of C.L.R. James, the great West Indian revolutionary and author of the only really serious book on the Haitian Revolution, Black Jacobins, of Victor Serge and his memoirs of a revolutionary, and his wonderful novel, The Case of Tulayev, which is the first novel that, really to describe the Gulag. It's thought, in fact, Victor Serge coined the word totalitarian to describe Stalinism.
There was a little indie movie of that period called Praise Marx and Pass the Ammunition.
There was.
Which was about groupuscules of that sort and how they spent more of their time fighting each other than capitalism. Would you say that was true of your
Yes, I'd have to say that it was, but it's good training, that. It's like Talmudic disputations. They can build muscle, build sinew. They teach you how to argue. And they also teach you that fratricide is a very important principle in politics. Isaac Deutscher, who I admired very much, who was the biographer of Trotsky, had been a brilliant yeshiva student before he saw the error of his ways in Poland. And when he did his Torah portion, rabbis, men of learning, came from all over Poland to see this wonder-working kid who could do the whole commentary on all subjects. And but the question he had to answer was this: there's a bird in the Talmud, a miraculous bird, visits the world very infrequently, and when it does so, does something very few birds do. It throws up or spits on the ground. If you can get this bird spit, you can get to it, it will grant every wish. It'll be a miracle-working thing. And there's a lot of commentary on this, and there's a lot of commentary on those commentaries, and a great deal of learned disputation among rabbis. And the question Deutsch had to answer was this. Can you guess?
No, I would leave it to you.
Is the bird spit kosher or treif? Now, a lot of thought went into that. I used to admire the way he could do that. He said it was actually, in the end, rather stultifying. It was a bit too much like being made to memorize the Quran. He got out of it. But I still think that those late-night logic chopping sessions help one to argue.
And
by the way, it's treif, I think.
Yes.
Most of the sages are agreed it's treif.
It's not prepared properly. No.
It's not glat.
Bird vomit, I can't imagine.
Glat bird vomit. It's like a Monty Python.
Speaking of bird vomit, where do you stand on Trotsky these days?
Well, the fascination of Lev Davidovich, continuing in my case, is that he combined the role of being the revolutionary, the man of action, with being the intellectual and the writer. I mean, he helps to compose the Surrealist Manifesto. He appears as a character, fascinating character, in the novels of Saul Bellow and Mary McCarthy. Norman Mailer had all his life a guru. Jean Malaquet, a Swiss Frenchman, who was a very rarefied and arcane kind of a Trotskyist. So and most of the other figures of the Russian Revolution have passed into history. They didn't make it into the 21st century as objects of real study, I'm afraid. Not Lenin, not even Bukharin, certainly not Stalin. Trotsky is still interesting. He still repays study. And he got the main thing right, which was, he said that after the Munich deal was made, where Chamberlain was prepared to hand over the whole of European democracy just to give a new lease of life on Britain's control of India, he says Mr. Chamberlain thinks he's been clever in this maneuver, but what he has brought about is the next agreement, which will be the one between Stalin and Hitler. So that'll be even more important, and it will end in a war, a terrifying war, and it won't be Stalin who starts it.
And yet, Trotsky, of course, founder of the Red Army, not a popular army in the former Soviet Union.
Don't knock the Red Army completely. I mean, it defeated the White Army. And if the White Army had won in Russia, then the word for fascism would be a Russian word instead of an Italian word. Let's forget. These are the people who brought us the pogroms and the protocols of the Elders of Zion. In fact, they brought them, after their defeat, rather regrettably, they brought them to Europe. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is
someone had to give them a hiding, I think.
And what I'm saying is this for you a God that failed, or is it not?
Well, there are no gods to begin with, if you see what I mean, but I know why you ask it like that. No, it's not. It's just a way of thinking about ironies of history. It's no longer a political allegiance, no.
So that now discredited but sometimes useful thinker Karl Marx,
Yes.
does he have stuff to say to you still? He had quite a lot to say to Margaret Thatcher, it seems. Actually.
Yes. I say in the opening of the book that just as the day I became 59 and a half, which is the day on which you're allowed to touch your carefully hoarded Wall Street pension fund, Lehman Brothers went tits up on me.
Yes.
And so did everyone else after that. And I suddenly thought, now, isn't this interesting? You remember the crisis. I thought, now, I can read this off from memory. The historic struggle between finance capital and industrial capital. The crisis of overproduction. These people can't shift the stuff they've made, a lot of which is junk. The rewards going to people who make money rather than who earn it. The falling rate of profit. All of this, absolutely fascinating. The old boy got a lot of that right. It's just that the prognostic part of it isn't as tempting as it once seemed, shall we say.
And your relationships with the former comrades, how are they these days?
It depends. Win some, lose some. Lost a few friends who really did think that, George Bush was Hitler or Saddam Hussein was a secular rationalist. Amazing the stuff people will try out on you. But in exchange, met some very nice Iraqis and Kurds who now have extremely nice ones. Well, some of them have been friends of mine before, who now have a republic in which there are elections, a parliament, things like that.
Let's just rewind a little bit, because I think one of the things that is very affecting in the book at the beginning is your accounts of your parents. Both the commander, as you call him, your father, who you present as a somewhat, as a kind of stoic but not fantastically emotionally articulate person, and your mother, who hoped for more and was, had a kind of gaiety that she perhaps was not satisfied by him, and then this tragic fate that befell her. I don't know whether you want to talk about that a little bit.
Well, the book is to quite a large extent about my personality as a divided self, not just in the political and ideological, but in every respect. And it begins by having radically discrepant parents. My father, who was 12 years older than my mother, had given his entire life to the Royal Navy and been a very disciplined and very hardy warrior in it, and at the end of the war had been rather let go by the Navy. They downsized and sort of dumped him on the beach, and he never forgot it, never got over it. And I was brought up guessing a formulation which I've only put into words in this book, which is a family of people who were Tories but with nothing to be Tory about. Their loyalty to the establishment, to the crown, the empire, and the admiralty and so on had been set at a very low price. And he never quite recovered from this. And he was from a very dour Baptist, Calvinist background in Portsmouth dockyards. I remember when I was young once, I must be about 8, he liked to have breakfast alone in the morning. He was an early riser. He messed around in the kitchen in solitude. Baked eggs, I remember he liked, and strong tea and so on. And I thought, I'm not an early riser at all, but I thought, perhaps it'd be nice to go down and have breakfast with the old man one of these days. So one morning I put on my jammies, tottered down the stairs into the kitchen. Morning, Daddy. He looked up at me and said, bloody hell, it'll be family prayers next. So I thought, okay, you don't have to tell me twice. And I don't particularly like breakfast anyway, so while all this was happening, Yvonne would have been upstairs with her makeup and trying to put on a fashionable look for the day. She was very beautiful. She was a milliner. She wanted to make a success of a dress shop. He never managed it, alas. But, and she wanted a life where we went to the theatre and sharp cocktail parties and things of this kind, and there was no money for this sort of thing. And he bored her. So I could tell that this was a very radically oppositional family to be from. And, well, she left him, waiting too long, as respectable women did in those days, especially in the English lower middle class, waiting too long, waiting till my brother and I were off the scene, took up with a man who wasn't boring, who was witty and playful and literate.
And was an unfrocked or...
But I was a spoiled, unfrocked priest of the Church of England, and a recent convert to the toilsome jabberings of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi.
Yes.
His sail was so raised as to be ballooned by any wind of bullshit that came by. But for all his outward charm and so on, he was, I think the word we would now use would be bipolar. He was manic depressive and he was suicidal, and he talked her into a suicide pact in Athens when I was 23, and I had to go to Athens, it having been reported as a murder. So I went. My mother's room in this hotel was when I saw it, a crime scene. And there were tanks in the street outside. There was a revolution and counter-revolution going on in Greece. The junta was beginning to fall apart. It was firing wildly into the crowd, and it was a very melodramatic week for me. I hope I could convey some of it in the book.
Almost, I mean, the really heartbreaking thing in that moment is discovering in the records of the hotel that there had been 5 attempts by her to telephone you.
Yes, she was very keen on me, keen enough to keep her Jewishness from me because she didn't want me to suffer as she and her mother had from the sort of low-level discrimination you can have in England. You catch it on the edge of a remark, as Harold Abrams says in Chariots of Fire. So we never had the discussion. I'll never know why she did. I think she wanted me to pass and to become an English gentleman. So you be the judge of how well that worked out.
Yeah.
But no, she had desperately tried to ring me, and I was young in London in those days. I'd just started working at the New Statesman. I'd just moved to the capital. I wasn't home that much, and I never got the calls, and there were no answering machines or voicemails and little cell phones in those days. So you hear a lot of babble, Salman, don't you, about closure, for example, and therapy and the healing of the wounds. Well, all of this is meaningless to me, but it's meaningless for a particular reason. I can't get closure now, because I'm sure, and I never will. I know if she'd heard my voice, it would have steadied her, rallied her. I know it would have done. And she didn't. So and some wounds, I think, should stay fresh.
Yes.
I don't want them to be healed, particularly.
No, well,
Take them to my own grave.
It's an astonishing and painful moment in the book. And then there's the discovery of the thing she had concealed from you.
Yes.
Which is her and therefore your Jewishness.
Yes.
Just talk a little bit about how you came
I knew
to
there
know
was a
about that.
family secret, but I didn't quite know what it was. And it was to do with her mother, my granny, Dodo, as we used to call her, who had been born, I now know, in Liverpool as Dorothy Levin, and from a family that had left Poland when it was still Germany, actually, in the late 19th century, getting out in good time. I describe in the book going to that part of Poland last summer. I've been a couple of times on what you might call a roots trip. Very fascinating area. The bit where Helen Thomas thinks all Jews should live. And I don't know if she knows this, but it can be very upsetting when that border moves, even by a foot. It's not just not good for the Jews, it's not good for the Germans or the Poles or the Russians either. It's a horrible, sinister belt, punctuated with a lot of great beauty. And I went to see if there were any members of the family who'd stayed behind, and if they'd survived. But it was a clean sweep.
There was one of the moments, just to reduce this to a lower note, there's one of these moments in Poland where you actually often speak during the book with self-admiration about the strength of your resistance to alcohol.
Yeah.
And there is a moment in Poland where you appear to go on one of these drinking jags, which is complimented by your Polish hosts,
Yes.
who inform you at the end of the evening that they have now revealed that you are truly a Pole.
A real Pole. And I didn't know how right they were.
Yes. Tu es un vrai Polonais.
This was at the beginning, I went to Poland at the very beginning of what became the Solidarity movement, to a group of Polish intellectuals and workers. By the way, many of them quite influenced by Trotskyism, who'd started a workers' defense committee. It was a very cold winter in '75, and I wrote a piece saying, I think this is different, because this is a workers' opposition to communism now. They won't be able to put down that so easily. But they threw a party for me and my girlfriend on Christmas Eve. And this is ridiculously exaggerated about me, but as it happens, I can take a drink if I have to.
I've heard that.
And another rule, one must be civil. If someone offers you a lot of vodka, it's rude to say, impolite. So they took little miniatures, lined them up opposite ends of a table, and this very tough Pole, Vitold, said, "I'll race you to the end," taking position on his side of the table. No, I think it was a dead heat.
Impressive.
And he said, "Christophe," because we were using sort of dog French to communicate it. "Christophe, tu es un vrai Polonais." And I thought I'd take that kindly.
Yes.
And see how handy it can come in, you know.
Yes.
Nothing's wasted if you think about it in the right way.
As John Cleese once said, what can you do when you're up against a pole? Let me ask you, given this, I mean, you talk a lot in the book about all the travels to various hotspots of the world and encounters and reportage. And as I say, one of the things that I think many people might say characterizes you is the strength of your feelings in both directions, both in terms of affiliation and in terms of rejection. You know? If you had to, I mean, as I say, we've been talking about all the people you can't stand. If you had to talk about the causes, issues that you'd encountered in your travels that you most admired and felt most drawn to, what would those be?
Well, a good example, because it also shows how things can, following a certain commitment, could lead you slightly to change it or adapt it in ways you might not think, was in Argentina, where I was during the reign of the death squad terror, the so-called dirty war, filthy war, actually, in the late 70s. And almost everyone I met in Argentina had a family member missing, and the man who I had to interview, the president, Rafael Videla, is now in jail. Try this. He's in jail for what? He's in jail for selling the babies of the rape and torture victims that were produced in his own private prison in Buenos Aires. It's a lot. He's one of Henry Kissinger's best friends. But Kissinger is still on the outside, astonishingly to me. Anyways, I went around finding out more and more about this, had a terrifying interview with President Videla, where he more or less admitted if these people, especially these communist Jews, these subversive Jews, if they want to fight, they can have one. Well, I was trying to find out what had happened to the late, wonderful Jacobo Timmerman, who was definitely the object of a pogrom that was going on. So I got out of there feeling pretty sickened, and after going to a wonderful evening and morning with Jorge Luis Borges, who then lived there, and reading to him when he was blind, and disagreeing with him about Pinochet, who he quite admired, and all of this. And I got back to England and wrote it all up and spoke at a lot of meetings about it. And then quite shortly after that, there was a war between Britain and Argentina, in which Mrs. Thatcher says, these are a bunch of fascist thugs and murderers and torturers, and they've tried to take a bit of British territory in the South Atlantic. Certainly not, was her view. Absolutely have to fight this. You can't be pushed around by a gang of rapists and torturers. And I thought, good for you. No, I could not possibly agree with you more. So but most of the people on the left absolutely failed completely to see that point, that we would not only regain the Falkland Islands, the Malvinas Islands if you prefer, but by doing so discredit and demolish the junta. They didn't care about that at all.
Which it did.
Which it jolly well did, yeah.
And well, here's an irony, though. Immediately before the Falklands-Malvinas War, Margaret Thatcher's approval ratings were lower than that of any British Prime Minister since such ratings were kept. Then she won the war. And so essentially what happened is the British Army won the war on behalf of the people of Argentina. They got democracy.
Yes.
We got a decade of Margaret Thatcher.
Yes.
So the question is, who won the war?
And Commander Hitchens, who'd been stationed in the Falkland Islands and was a very solid conservative, when I told him, hey, well done, just for once, good for the Royal Navy, he was completely against it. He thought all things like that were sentimental and doomed and not worth fighting over.
Well, one of the things we have in
Should
common...
I tell you about my sex life with Mrs. Thatcher?
If you would like to, yes. No, I feel they need to know.
Because I also thought I saw there a premonition of something coming, as in Poland. I went to I'd written that I thought she was rather charismatic. This was a time when...
I think the word you used was sexy.
Yes.
Well, I think that, let's be clear.
I'm already surging around in my chair. She had the most amazing skin. And shatteringly beautiful cat-like eyes. And when we met, I thought she knew who I was, because you don't get many socialist journalists writing of you if you're leader of the Conservative Party, that you're
really sexy.
That you stink of sex.
Very,
you don't get that.
That you're really hot.
So there was a little sort of thin bat squeak of sexuality as we touched hands.
Yes.
Oh Christ! And then we got into a fight because I thought she was terrible politically about Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and I was right on the point of fact, and she was wrong. But she maintained her position with such ferocity that for a bit I thought, well, it's only a small point. And I sort of bowed to let her have it like this. And I straightened up again. And then she said, no, bow lower. And I found I had no volition. Bowed lower, quite a lot lower, regained the vertical. She said, no, much lower. And as I bent almost double, she came round behind me with a rolled-up paper from the parliamentary proceedings of the day and thwacked me on the ass.
Spanked you?
Yeah. Spanked me. And as I sort of jerked back, in what I hope was a moment of adorable disorder, I could see her walking away, looking over her shoulder with, I swear it was a roll of the hip, and she said, naughty boy. I knew then that she would...
The English love this stuff.
They do.
They do. And I think you should have the T-shirt saying, I was spanked by Margaret Thatcher.
Well, everyone else was surprised how she went through the male establishment of that party like an avenging flame and gelded and
she wasn't,
stomped a lot of them. I wasn't surprised at all.
The only dominatrix to be Prime Minister of a Western democracy. There's actually my favourite. There were many, as you remember, jokes about Margaret Thatcher. My favourite one was when Margaret Thatcher and the cabinet go to lunch. And in a private room in a restaurant, and the waiter comes up to her and says, what would you have, madam? And she says, I'll have the steak. And he says, very good, madam. And the vegetables? She says, they'll have the same as me.
Very good. Well, I claim I saw it coming. And I had to face, had been an active, devoted member of the Labour Party and parties to its left as well. But I actually thought it was not a bad thing that she won the election in '79, because she was the only conviction politician running, and she was the only one who had any sort of programme for change. And when the Labour Party's got itself into that position, I think it has to lose for a bit.
Well, rather like it had to lose just now.
Yes, I think so.
One of the things we have in common is the Nicaraguan excursion, and I know that you felt very strongly against the Contra project, which was supported by the United States. I remember I wrote a little reportage book about it, and I remember when I came to America to publish the book, I went on a live radio program in, I think, San Francisco, and the first question I was asked was, so, Mr. Rushdie, to what extent are you a communist stooge? I answered, I'm rather proud of answering, I said, to a certain extent. And that so demolished the host that he didn't know what to say.
To a limited degree. I wrote a defense of you on that.
Yes, you did, because I remember that, I think it was The Atlantic, or some such. No, it wasn't. It was the New Republic. It was our good friend, Mr. Weaseltier, gave the book for review to the leader of the Contras. As a kind of objective review.
Yes. Arturo.
It's Arturo Cruz.
Yes, so they did.
So who trashed it, of course, for entirely literary reasons. One of the things
it was a better review than the one you got from the Ayatollah Khomeini.
Yes, that was...
I remember that one.
That's V.S. Naipaul's joke.
Talking of reviews by politicians, I think that one I remember thinking was a real slam.
But, but ask yourself this. Would it not be worse to receive a good review from the Ayatollah Khomeini?
How right you are.
I mean, that's the only thing worse than the bad review.
Or to give him one, as so many people did.
Yes, somebody once brought me a book for signature, a copy of the Satanic Verses, in which they had pasted what they said was Khomeini's signature. Huh? and said, would I sign next to it? And so I did. So somewhere out there, collectors,
Yes.
there's a book with both our signatures in it. Anyway, but the thing about the Contra War was that it was a very ugly little thing that America did of trying to squash this country, which could very easily have been very pro-American. I mean, one of the things that I found in Nicaragua was that they loved baseball, obsessed with baseball, obsessed with Major League Baseball. And all the writers they most admired were American poets. You know, Walt Whitman, Marianne Moore, these were the people that they loved most. And this was a country which could just easily, just by doing that, have been turned into an ally. And yet it was crushed. On the other hand, the Sandinistas had some snakes in their number, not least the president, Daniel Ortega. So what do you think now, revisiting that subject?
Well, it was another occasion where I tried to manage the two sets of books. I mean, I made a number of trips there reporting on what I thought was the atrocity and illegality of the Contra operation. One says Contra, like some people say insurgent. It's a bit flattering to describe as an against-Nick, someone who's actually a mercenary of a previous very highly authoritarian regime.
Yes.
What's Contra about that? I mean, except contra to human dignity. So I didn't like any of that, but I also didn't like the way the Sandinistas were treating the press and the magazines.
No.
And that when they appeared on television, they were almost always wearing a uniform. This on the Cuban model. Not Sergio Ramirez, who remember.
No, he was a
very,
novelist.
very good Nicaraguan novelist. He was the only member of the Sandinista directorate who didn't wear a uniform. He's now got a party of his own. He's through with them. So I could tell that there was going to be a split. Once again, there was going to be fratricide between the comrades. So I thought, I have to write about that too, if you're going to be honest.
Yeah. Well, you know, Nicaragua, it struck me, one of the things that was really extraordinary about it is it actually has yellow brick roads.
Yes.
And the reason for that is that the previous dictator, Somoza, owned a brick factory. And so he made sure that all the roads were made of his bricks. So you actually can, you know, follow the yellow brick road. And it doesn't take you to anywhere as interesting as ours. But actually, my favorite moment in Nicaragua when I was there, I had this voluble and gorgeous blonde interpreter. And at one point, she came to me very, very excited. And she said, you know who's coming to Nicaragua? Bono's coming. And I said, okay, that's great. That's great. And she said to me, in the same eagerness, she said, tell me, who is Bono? A story I was
I
able
thought
to...
it was. I used to think it was Sonny. I did.
Yeah, exactly.
And I thought in that case, I'm so glad he's going to Nicaragua.
Is Cher coming too?
Is Cher coming too?
Anyway, I was actually able to tell Bono
not
that
enough
story, and
shares.
I'm not sure how amused he was.
But I mean, it's not the first time around for me with that, because when I was in the International Socialists in 1968, I went to this work camp in Cuba, where I was there for, among other things, the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia, which Castro publicly supported. And there was a huge split, revolution within the revolution is how I describe it. In this camp of young revolutionaries who'd come from all over the world, I met there some people who later became members of the Baader-Meinhof and Red Brigade groups. I also met people who later became leaders of their countries in Portuguese Africa through a liberation struggle. It was a many-faceted thing. It didn't yield to any one completely dogmatic pattern.
Well,
and I tried to plant coffee to diversify the Cuban economy.
did it grow?
And that was a failure.
No.
You still can't get a decent cup of coffee in Havana.
That would be your
Most
fault.
days, it's as often as not, they don't have a proper coffee. Incredible.
So if you'd been better at it, there might be coffee in Havana.
Well, I wasn't going to do any cane cutting, thanks all this.
No, I cannot see
I'm
you.
not somehow a cane cutter.
I don't see you.
Anyway, the thing was to diversify the economy so as to reduce its historic dependence on colonial poisons like tobacco and sugar, none of which I would touch.
Yeah. No, of course
Rum.
not. No, I've never heard that you ever
fool with that stuff.
had a drink. One of the other things, apart from causes that you have espoused, that's very clear from this book, is the enormous importance in your life of friendship. And there's a sequence of chapters in the book which portray friendships with Martin Amis and James Fenton, and sort of damaged one with Edward Said, and so on. And the one with Martin sort of teeters on the edge of homosexuality. In fact, you hypothesize about it. You like to go into that at all?
Expand, you mean? Or would you rather enlarge?
Would you like to,
Large.
You could tune
I do remember when having a fling with his sister, who had very much the same colour and complexion as him. If that wasn't perhaps a bit brideshead, The only Amos I've ever got into the sack. And I certainly do love him very dearly, very passionately. And I posed the question in the book, where I pour out all my passion about him. Is it possible to have a heterosexual relationship with a man? Discuss. I think possibly not, but it's worth trying. And the way we resolved it was by having a very long and warm and tender discussion about the women we knew.
That you had in common, or just that you knew?
So to say, yes. Not the discussion you might imagine it being, not the locker room discussion, but a constant meditation on the feminine principle. Not always as high-toned as that, because when he was writing Money, which was his breakthrough novel of the 80s, he did, and I'm forced to describe this in the book, he did make me come with him to a brothel on Lexington Avenue for fieldwork purposes.
Where on Lexington Avenue?
It was in the sort of low 30s, I'd say. It was called the Tahisha.
You know what's there now? The headquarters of Opus Dei.
Are you kidding me?
34th at Lexington.
Do you mind if I ask how you know what it was before?
Those of us who have read the Da Vinci Code know a lot of things.
Well, this was this horrid little episode that I described, squalid little episode, is in the way the most Proustian of my efforts, because it shows how you can get back wasted time. Because out of that unbelievably foul trip come 3 or 4 pages of absolutely brilliant literary comedy in
It's
Money,
very funny stuff.
where the Tahisha becomes the Happy Isles, under the Bam, under the Boo, and John Self gets the worst time a man could ever have had from a hooker. So you never know. Those little minxes did not know that they were in the service of literature that day.
One of the things I think that's interesting about your friendship with Mart is that it hasn't seemed to have stopped you from having a go at him when he, in your view, does something dumb. So when he wrote the Stalin book, for example, you had a real go at him.
Yes.
In print.
Yes.
What was his response to that?
Somewhat chastened. In fact, he's corrected some of the things in the paperback that I was able to draw attention to. But neither of us would make a personal dispute into a political one, or do I mean the other way around? In other words, for a political disagreement, we wouldn't sacrifice a friendship. I actually always find that people who will do that are very suspect. You'd have to have, well, I do describe the case where it did have to happen, I thought, in the case of our old friend, yours and my old friend, Edward Said, which was he published something which didn't quote me, but quoted something I had said, and said that he thought it was racist. And I thought, well, that crosses my line, certainly, and I presume his. I mean, I think an allegation like that, even if made in anger, has to be taken seriously. It would be very bad if that word had its currency debased. So that was a frotter, but that was on a matter of real principle.
Yeah, well, I mean, talking about disagreements between friends, I suppose we should not avoid the disagreement between us, which has to do with Iraq.
Right.
Whereas I found it not just possible, but correct to support the post 9/11 incursion into Afghanistan to attack Al-Qaeda in its home base. it always struck me as, if you like, a change of subject to go to Iraq, which prevented this country from finishing what it might have been able to do in Afghanistan at that time, and resulted in a sort of long and ugly war. Now, you obviously have a different portrait of those events.
Well, and I have a slightly different memory of some of the things you said about Saddam Hussein at the time as well.
No, I mean, I'm not a fan of Saddam Hussein.
And Ahmed Chalabi, and you had some warm words to say for the regime change community.
Well, I said if it were possible, as happened in Afghanistan, to build a genuine international coalition to go in there and deal with it,
yes, then
that would be desirable. But there was no such coalition.
No, there isn't one in Afghanistan either, as you must have noticed.
Not now.
No, I don't think there was then. It was essentially Anglo-American, like Iraq. Well,
but how do you think it's?
I take the 9/11 thing out of the equation altogether. After the overthrow of Slobodan Milosevic, which I also witnessed in Bosnia and Croatia and Montenegro and elsewhere, Tony Blair made a speech in Chicago in '99, saying that there's one very menacing, aggressive totalitarian regime gone, and we should all be proud of getting rid of it. But there's another, even worse one, with which we're bound to have another round. Another confrontation is coming with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And that was when George Bush was governor of Texas and didn't know where Iraq was. And the Congress, on the initiative, Senate and House, on the initiative of, in part, the Clinton-Gore administration, had passed a law, the Iraq Liberation Act, in 1998, that said it shall be the policy of these United States to remove the government of Saddam Hussein and give Iraq back to the Iraqis. So the principle of that had been decided long before the Al-Qaeda strike on Manhattan.
Yeah. I think that we have to make some time for the audience to ask you questions, which I have here. But before we do that, I feel we should descend to some much lower plane. Hitch 22 also derives from a game that we once made up about the titles of books and films and so on that don't quite make it somehow.
Shall we take it in turns?
You go first if you like.
No, you. It's
All
your idea.
All right, well, A Farewell to Weapons.
The Big Gatsby.
For Whom the Bell Rings.
Portrait of a Woman.
Yes. Laughter House 5.
Good Expectations.
Yes. Toby Dick. Which there's a variation,
Toby,
which is
yes.
Moby Prick.
Mr. Zhivago.
To Kill a Hummingbird.
2 Days in the Life of Ivan Denisovic.
Blueberry Finn.
And Hitch 22.
Hitch 22.
He said Hitch 22, and I thought that might come in very handy.
Yes, yes. Uncle Tim's
Shall we do
cabin.
one more game, or would that be rough?
Well, the others are all obscene, but they could take it.
But you know, people come here for smut.
Yeah, well,
I know this crowd at the Y, and I know what they want.
as always,
Filth is what they
as always in matters of smut, I defer to you.
Well, it may seem pathetic, but as I was saying earlier about other enterprises, if you can build muscle, you can keep trying with something. It may seem puerile or banal, but it'll pay off in the end. So we used to sit around in a terrible Turkish Cypriot kebab house and other places too, and just take out a well-known word from any well-known phrase or saying. In this case, the word heart, and replace it with the word dick. So you would get bury my dick at Wounded Knee. I left my dick in San Francisco.
Yes.
That's when your dick aches begin.
Yes.
You'll be doing this later on as you make your way
Yes.
home.
All of these are like computer viruses. Once they're in your brain,
They'll
the
Dick Break Hotel.
Yes.
Don't go breaking my dick. Well, anyway. So we would start, it got really bad, emailing to each other, comparing notes and so forth. But it became a bit of a ding and search, sort of slightly just for its own sake. And then, one day, Woody Allen runs off with his daughter. his adopted daughter, and decides to set up housekeeping with her. And he gets asked, "Mr. Allen, what are you doing? Running off with your adopted daughter and making her your wife?" And he says, "Well, the heart wants what it wants." Made it all somehow worthwhile.
All right. Yes. Okay.
I should also tell your own personal one.
Which one?
The great achievement. Well, I say that finally, when Salman had joined our circle, the whole standard of stuff went up. And one day, and it's the bits of it that belong entirely to him, one day someone came to a dinner party and said he'd been trapped on a plane with a Robert Ludlum novel and was bitching about it as one might. There's nothing else to read. And he said, I'll condense this, but what would a Shakespeare play be like if Robert Ludlum had titled it? These titles are so portentous, you know, the Eiger whatnot,
Sanction,
the
Rhineman Exchange.
Born Inheritance, the Rhineman Exchange. And so what would a Shakespeare play look like? And someone bristled. He had no more notice than I'm giving you. I said, okay, what would Hamlet be? And he said, the Elsinore Vacillation. I thought, well, he can't do that twice. So what about Macbeth? The Dunsinane Reforestation. And we went, I can remember the Rialto Sanction.
The Rialto Sanction, yes. There's the kerchief implication.
The kerchief implication. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Salman Rushdie.
All right.
I should say, Sir Salman Rushdie.
Back on the other, yes. Romeo and Julie, I liked.
Romeo and Julie.
Yes. Uncle Tim's cab is... Anyway, all right, the audience would like to ask you some stuff. Yeah. So I'm just sorting through these. All right, let's ask, since this is a contrarian question, I'll ask it. What do you find the most compelling argument for the existence of God?
Well, the reason I say that God, or that religion poisons everything, is it makes intelligent people say stupid things, and it makes good people do bad things. And the arguments are not very good. Some of the people making them are extremely intelligent, but they're rather stuck with the old script. And when they get any better than the old script, which is really pretty shabby and battered by now, the burning bush, if you will, they tend to borrow from work. They stand on the shoulders of other schools. So now, having fought for a long time against the idea of the Big Bang and evolution as the origins of life and the cosmos, they now decide to annex it. They become frightfully interested in it, and they say, actually, the Big Bang is so amazing that it must have been God after all that did this. And we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the wonderful fine-tuning that produces life. Slightly solipsistic argument, as you can see. But let's say, I've discussed this with my comrades as well, that's one that we find impressive because at least it takes some work. It's borrowed plumes from them, but it means some work on our part. And we have said, and we think that the fine-tuning may be pretty amazing, but is it more amazing than the existence of 10, 100, 1,000 billion other planets in the universe where there's no life at all? Some design, okay? So we're getting some traction there. No, but it's been worth that. That's an argument I've found worth taking part in.
I mean, there's actually the term used to describe that argument is the anthropic fallacy.
Yes.
That it must be God because otherwise we wouldn't be here to think that it must be God.
Yeah. Yes. So if you're an oyster in a tide pool, you can't get into or out of. And it's warm in this particular bay, and stuff, mollusks and other things are washed into it for you to eat. You don't have to go anywhere or do anything. Well, someone must love me.
There must be a God.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Actually, it's just the moon. But,
and the walrus and the carpenter. Yes. As it happens, just about to come trudging along that beach.
Let's not start reciting poetry now. Okay, you're quoted in Sunday's Times as saying that trust is not the same thing as faith. Could you elaborate on the difference?
Well, I had to deal quickly with a rather eccentric question from Miss Deborah Solomon.
Good Lord.
Which was, she thought, I think she thinks if she asks a question like this, people will have to come up with something new to say. And she may be right. because she said, wasn't it obvious that I thought that Martin Amis was the Messiah? Never been asked that before.
No.
And I said, that's the sort of thing that would make both of us throw up, if you want to know.
Yes, that's a startling.
Throw up things we didn't even remember eating. And so in order to, I wanted to say that faith
What
is
sort of
not-
God would it be that would send Martin as the Messiah?
Yes, I know. It'd be, well, when you think of some people who have been hailed as the Messiah, go ask. So in order to, because the word I wanted to repudiate was faith, I put a softer one in its place, namely trust. It's a holding action.
Yes. Do you have an opinion, it says here, of the new Arizona immigration law?
When I was a green card holder, which I was for 25 years almost of my life before I became an American citizen, very movingly described in the book, available at fine bookstores everywhere, I was told that it was a federal law that I never left the house without having my green card on me. And I never did. I always carried it. And I say in the book, which I wrote before Arizona, that if I was regularly stopped and asked for it all the time, my attitude to the United States would not be the same, though I think it's a perfectly defensible law. I was only ever asked for it by immigration officers. But then I don't look conspicuously Guatemalan.
No. Well, we see in the paper today that there's an enormous exodus of Hispanic people from Arizona because they feel threatened. So clearly somebody feels
I think
that it's
that's
going to be...
we're slightly crying before. What I do think, I don't think at all. It's been a federal law for a long, long time. If you are not in this country as a citizen, you must be able to show that you are here legally. And I went through a lot of trouble to, as they say, work hard and play by the rules. And I resent people who don't. And I'm not completely won over by the idea that the monopoly on our demographic change is held by Mexico and its neighbors. I mean, every available spot for immigration in a lot of states now is monopolized by them. I would like to see a lot more Bosnians coming to the United States, a lot more people from South Africa, a lot more people from Ireland and Indonesia and so forth. But it seems to me that there's something not necessarily adorable. So, well, that's too bad. What you're going to get is an Anglo-Hispanic America, and you have no say in that. So I can perfectly see that there's more than one argument involved here.
Well, this leads on to the America question, which actually we didn't get to, so it's good to get to it, which is, do you now think of yourself as American or British?
Oh, when I came to the realization in the years immediately following 2001 that I was identifying much more with the United States and feeling I was cheating on my dues by not becoming a citizen. So I did that very full-heartedly, and that's what the chapter's about. But of course I did it when I was over 50. And you can't, I'm glad there's such a thing as an Anglo-American, in other words, because that's what I am. It's interesting, the hyphenation thing. You can have people who are Greek Americans, Jewish Americans. Oddly enough, Jewish organizations put the American first, the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress. But anyway, and they have National Day parades and things of this kind. But there's no such thing as an English American. And I rather shudder to think what our National Day parade down Fifth Avenue would look like on St. George's Day every year, with impatient Irish policemen patrolling the Brits. Here they come.
With their warm beer in their hands.
We were here first, and everyone speaks our language. And the American Revolution was an English revolution. It was borrowed from the great principles of Cromwell and the Levellers and the removal of the Stuarts.
Not the French at all.
Not really, because it rather precedes the French.
So
more Locke, I would say, than Voltaire. And Thomas Paine, of course, who is the great inheritor of, wrote a book about him, of the English radical revolutionary, the one that separated the monarch's head from his shoulders.
So the empire continues.
Well, no, the greatest anti-colonial revolution was fought by English settlers in the British Empire in America.
Okay, so this, I don't know if you're into this or not. Are you good at limericks?
Yes.
All right. Could you please
I can squeeze one out if I need
Could you regale us with a limerick?
Well, again, you see, people think this is an invitation to filth. You can already see
Yes,
them
yes, you do that, yes.
thinking, I know what they want. But the limerick is not a filth delivery system. It can be
It
one,
can be.
as in the case of the young engine driver named Hunt, who, when given an engine to shunt, saw a runaway truck and by yelling out, "Duck," saved the life of the driver in front.
Yes.
That's a good one.
Now,
And then-
can I offer you, in that vein,
Yes.
after Kenneth Tynan, theatre critic, became the first person to say fuck on British television, the next day, the Daily Mirror, the main, sort of like the New York Post, had the following limerick on its front page. It said, "In a midsummer night, playing puck, a Shakespearean actor got stuck. But as he'd never heard of that four-letter word, he merely remarked, 'What bad luck.'"
That's very good. The master of this is still living, Robert Conquest, great poet, great historian of Solionism, great friend of Philip Larkin and Kingsley Amis. And he can do compendious limericks that are very useful for condensing and mnemonic purposes. For example, you all know Jacques' speech in The Seven Ages of Man in Act 2 about how the world's a stage. All the men and women, merely players, have their exits and their entrances, and each man in his time plays many parts. These being 7 ages, you know it. Okay? So that's, I think it's 24 lines, Jacques. Mm-hmm. Conquest has it like this: 7 ages, first puking and mewling, then very pissed off with your schooling, then fucks and then fights, then judging chaps' rights, then sitting in slippers, then drooling. It's got the whole thing in there.
Yes.
And Wendy Cope has done The Wasteland, if you want that.
Oh, The Wasteland, yes.
I think I can do this. In April, one seldom feels cheerful. Hot sun and hard dust make one fearful. Clairvoyance just depressed me. Commuters distress me. Met Stetson, gave him an earful.
So I will offer, just to finish this, can I offer The
Yeah,
Old
feel
Man
free.
of Japan?
You came off the Old Man of Japan.
There was an old man of Japan who could never get limericks to scan. And when they asked him why, he replied with a sigh, "Well, you see, it's because I always try and put as many words into the last line as I possibly can." So, all right, so... all right.
There's a lot of very good anti-clerical ones that are quite dirty. They say of the Bishop of Birmingham that he screws little boys while confirming them. They kneel on a hassock. He lifts up his cassock and pumps his episcopal sperm in him. Due for revival, I would say, quite soon.
All right, we'll stop. All right, here's a serious question. When you look into the future, as you do, with the escalating conflict between Muslim extremists soon to be armed with nuclear weapons and us, the West, what do you see?
Well, it's very evident to me that the theocracy in Iran is looking for a war and preparing for one, and thinks that even if it can't win one in what we might call the conventional sense, it might be able to bring on the coming of the long-awaited hidden imam, the Shia Messiah. So it would be win-win for them. So ever since I was young, we've been asking ourselves the question, what happens when an apocalyptic loon or messianic crackpot gets hold of an apocalyptic weapon? Well, we are about to find out. And the Revolutionary Guard, so-called, the Counter-Revolutionary Guard, which possesses this secret and illegal nuclear program, with which it hopes to tyrannize its Sunni Arab neighbors, largely, I think, is also now the organizer and bully-in-chief of a dictatorship that makes the lives of ordinary Iranians more miserable every day. So we've narrowed the target a bit. The two quarrels we have in Iran, with Iran, its appalling record as a dictatorship and its aggressive pursuit of nuclear weapons are turning into the one dispute. And what I'd like to see is a move internationally to support the democracy movement in Iran, the success of which would also demolish not just the regime but its its hellish secret deposits of weaponry.
Would you be against a military attempt to take out the Iranian nuclear capability?
No, I would not. I would not, and I would hope that if it came that way around, I'd prefer the other way around. But the synchronicity of the democracy movement and the urgency of the acquisition of the weapons are not very beautifully coordinated. But if there was a military strike, then it could have the effect also of demolishing the regime and freeing the Iranian people. They want to fight, and that means they'll get one, but they'll pick the timing of it, as Saddam Hussein used to do. Not we. I would rather that it was we who picked the time of the confrontation. Because if not, international law has been made nonsense. The Iranians have sworn in front of the United Nations. The allegations about the weapons do not come from the United States or from the CIA. They come from the International Atomic Energy Authority, the UN, the European Union, those who monitor the Non-Proliferation Treaty. If Iran does what it's clearly going to do, it means that we might as well give up on any idea of international law. It would make it the most internationally lawless regime.
Just to play devil's advocate here, a number of other countries have developed and acquired nuclear weapons, flouting test ban treaties. India, Pakistan, Israel. Nobody ever talks about making a military strike on those countries.
No.
So what is different here?
I think the difference is the rhetoric of the regime. It doesn't want a weapon in order to preserve or reinforce the current status quo, unstable and destabilizing though that could be. It quite clearly wants it in order to change the status quo. It's made noises about the physical destruction of one state in the region, and it's openly said that it thinks that quite large tracts of neighboring Arab land in states like Bahrain and Abu Dhabi are really Persian and should, by rights, be theirs. And so we're seeing the curtain raiser of an aggressive and expansionist regime which could take over, say, Bahrain and then say, well, we've done it. How much do you want to find out about our nuclear weapons? And we'd have to live in a world where we'd have to be polite to them. And I couldn't do that. I could not do that.
Right, well, I don't know.
Neither you, ladies and gentlemen, I hope. Rather muted applause there.
Oh, well. Well, continuing the devil's advocacy, there's only one country in the world that's ever used a nuclear weapon, and we're trying to suggest that maybe it should do so again, which is problematic at least.
Yes. I don't actually think there would be a nuclear strike on Iran. If it came to a strike, there are more precise and discrete weapons that can be employed.
And if you miss one nuclear bomb,
yes,
that's World War.
That can ruin your whole day.
Yeah, and the Iranians presumably know that.
Yes.
So I just say it's a dodgy strategy.
Very.
All right. Well, to end on a light note, what is the one person in history that you would most like to have, it says here, coffee with? And when we could, on playing your game, substitute the word sex for coffee.
In world history.
In world history. At any time, in any place. Coffee or sex?
I don't think Dorothea ever found out really what it was all about, did she?
No, I don't think so.
No, she's still going begging, as far as I can see.
Yeah. No, so
Dorothea. I think Dorothea.
Really? Can you say why?
Yeah, because she was obviously yearning and pining, and had found the male sex a disappointment.
And you could have changed that.
I would like to rescue her from that.
Yes, is it true? I read in the paper an interview with Reuters in which you were asked, what was your greatest regret? And you said, more people should have gone to bed with me. And if that is true, could you specify which people?
No, it was more, I was arguing for quantity, not quality.
Quantity.
with Dorothea, it's quality.
Yeah. Well, Christopher will be signing books afterwards, and if you want to give him your phone number. As he says, he's not interested in the quality. It's just It's just the concert. Anyway, Christopher Hitchens, thank you very much.